Hey guys, today we are going to be talking about ego, and I believe the ego, which basically is your sense of being someone separate from everyone and everything else, is one of the most important things that you could possibly learn about, because the ego is the mind's operating program. It's the filter that overlays our experience of reality. It informs every belief that we have, every decision that we make, all of the thoughts that we have in our lives. And if you want to improve yourself, if you want to develop yourself, or if you just want to be happier and enjoy life more, then you're going to need to have a deep understanding of how your mind's operating program works. And that's exactly what we'll be talking about in this video today. This video will go really deep on what the ego actually is, how it constructs reality as you know it. We'll talk about how to live in harmony with the ego. We'll talk about common cultural misconceptions of ego. We'll talk about how to develop this ego, because there's so many different theories and all these psychological models on how to develop the ego and how the ego actually develops over time. We'll talk about transcending the ego and the potential impact that ego development and transcendence could potentially have on the world. So if this interests you, buckle up, because this video will include just about all of the knowledge that I've gained about the ego from my own direct experience, as well as my several years of study about different perspectives of the ego. This will probably be about 40 to 45 minutes of your time, but if you listen attentively, I promise that this time will be well worth it. So this word ego is thrown around all the time in mainstream speak. You know, don't let your ego get in the way, is what they say. That's just your ego talking. Keep your ego in check. It's in these sayings like these that you probably hear the word ego the most, and these sayings represent the common cultural understanding of ego as a source of arrogance, pride, self-inflation, and delusion. They also highlight the commonly held notion that allowing the ego to dominate one's experience can become toxic. You might also hear the word ego being used in a more spiritual context in sayings such as, the ego is the belief in the false self, the ego is the source of all suffering, you must surrender your ego to the divine. And while I agree with, the essence of these spiritual sayings, I have also seen how they confuse a lot of people, leading to misinterpretation, because being fed with these cultural and spiritual notions of ego has led many to believe that the ego is bad, or even worse, that the ego is the enemy. There's actually a New York Times best-selling book with that exact title, The Ego is the Enemy. And I've never read that book. I'm not hating on that book or anything. I'm sure there's a number of great things being said in that book, but I believe that, viewing the ego as bad or as the enemy can only get you so far and will inevitably limit you on your journey of self-actualization. Because the funny thing is, the notion that ego is something to avoid or to eradicate is a statement that comes from, can you guess it? It comes from the ego. And viewing the ego this way, you become your own enemy. You become like the snake biting its own tail. The ego is so much more than just mere pride or arrogance or self-inflation. Sure, these things manifest from ego, not denying that, but the totality of what makes up an ego is so much more complex than that. What if I told you that the ego is one of the most beautiful features of existence? What if I told you that it's actually impossible to escape or get rid of the ego? And what if I told you that you could upgrade your ego throughout your life, leading to a more harmonious, love-based existence as opposed to a fear-based existence? Wouldn't this all be pretty helpful to know? So, like I said, this video is a bit of a longer one, and I don't want to waste your time here. So first, I just want to describe to you why understanding ego is so important and what the potential outcomes are of having increased awareness of the ego, so that you know that these outcomes are what you want, and so that you keep watching the video and listening attentively. So, put very simply, just to give a very rudimentary explanation, the ego is what you think you are. It is your self-concept, and this sense of self is composed of an enormous tapestry of beliefs, labels, thought patterns, associations, emotions, behaviors that have taken shape throughout the course of your life. And most people take this sense of self for granted. They think, who they are is just who they are. But what all spiritual teachings point towards across all regions, religions, and time periods is the notion that you are not your ego. Who you think you are is not who you actually are. For most people, the ego is operating as the subject of their experience, meaning that their consciousness is fused to their notions of who they think they are. They are blindly identified with their sense of self. But what if we made the ego the object of our experience rather than the subject? What if we took a step back in our awareness and chose to see the patterns and manifestations of ego as fleeting appearances in our experience, no different than the trees blowing in the wind or the cars bustling on the street? This notion of taking a step back and being present with whatever is in our awareness is essentially what mindfulness is. In fact, the dictionary definition of mindfulness is maintaining a moment-to-moment awareness of our thoughts, feelings, bodily sensations, and surrounding environment through a gentle, nurturing lens. So similar to weightlifting, mindfulness is a muscle that can be built up through consistent practice of fully attuning our awareness to the present moment. This is typically thought of as a meditative practice. And of course, mindfulness is not the only tool for increasing ego awareness, but it is probably the most essential, in my opinion. In addition to mindfulness, you could also do things like engage in reflective journaling, seek honest feedback on your personality and your behaviors from a trusted friend. You can expose yourself to new experiences and just notice, the walls and the boundaries that your ego throws up as you go about this process. And there's many more measures to doing this as well, but during this process of more deeply understanding your ego, think of yourself as walking through a cave with a lantern. Your aim is to illuminate the totality of the cave, to know all of your ins and outs, all of its twists and turns, and all of its mechanisms of self-preserving itself. And with this heightened self-awareness, through doing all of these practices, through gaining ego awareness, you gain greater insight into your patterns of thought, allowing you to recognize limiting beliefs, biases, and reactive tendencies that may be holding you back. With this also comes greatly enhanced emotional regulation. By seeing the ego as an object in one's experience, one is no longer so fused to the ego's habitual tendencies. This distance between awareness and self allows for healthier coping strategies to be adopted, allowing for a greater sense of equilibrium in the midst of life's challenges. And with increased ego awareness, you'll also find yourself just making higher quality decisions because you're no longer so clouded by the ego's reactive evaluations, judgments, and impulses, and so you will more easily be able to make conscious decisions that are in alignment with your deepest values and long-term goals that serve the well-being of all. This is what happens when you're not just so reactionary, not so fused to your ego. And with all of these shifts, you will find your relationships improving dramatically because you're not so blindly attached to the ways of your ego and your interactions with others, which are often fueled by a need for self-protection or self-inflation, pride. In addition to this, you will also be more able to truly listen to, see, and understand other people because by getting your ego out of the way, space opens up for true connection to others to take place. Connection that is rooted in genuine understanding, love for, and concern for the other person. And it's really not just space for connection with other people that opens up, space for connection with the entire world and really the entire universe opens up because really this is a deeply spiritual thing that we are talking about here with virtually every spiritual tradition emphasizing the importance of ego transcendence, the letting go of the limitations of the contracted personal identity into the expansive, more universal sense of self. I mean, imagine what a truly ego-aware world would look like. Do you see the vision? Do you not instantly intuit how much more peaceful this planet would be? The hallmark of ego development is an increase in openness and flexibility in one's experience. Your mind and way of being become less rigid and you stop being so dense and so defensive all the time. And really the reason for all of the war, genocide, racism, sexism, classism, or any other form of discrimination that you can think of is due to a lack of openness and flexibility in human worldviews and in human value systems. It is thinking that, my way is the one correct way and all of you are wrong, and then the people go and project their way onto other people who don't think the same way, and this creates chaos, conflict, and polarization, and in the worst of cases leads to horrible atrocities. All of these atrocities come about due to the ego's sense of superiority or worthiness of having more or being more or just wanting to be right and asserting their worldview over the other. And this is usually born from a deep-seated fear of the other belief system, the other value system, the other way of life, which really this virtually always comes from not truly understanding them, because the oppressor's mind is not open and flexible enough to truly listen to, see, and empathize with the other. A truly ego-aware world would not suffer from these collective problems like we do. An ego-aware world would be an inclusive and harmonious place. We'd be cooperating rather than competing. An ego-aware world would be united in a sense of connection to something beyond themselves, operating in a manner that serves not just their own well-being, but it really serves the well-being of all, because you're not just so dense and so focused on your own self-agenda. In an ego-aware world, you would not have to worry about falling through the cracks of society. You wouldn't have to push and strive and grind so hard in order to survive, in order to make it, for you would be taken care of by society at large. You would have the space and sense of safety to get in touch with the deepest parts of yourself, nourish your unique skills and interests and attributes, and you really have the space to be able to cultivate the gifts much easier that you have to offer the world. And the path towards creating this world, it really starts with you. It starts with your own personal transformation and maturation and ego development, which all of this is going to directly coincide with how aware you become of your ego. And the transformation that you undergo, it's going to have a ripple effect into the collective, touching every being you encounter and shaping the work you do in this world. And this will inspire other people to do the same thing. And one by one, people will begin looking deeper and deeper into their direct experience and just their life in general. They'll gain more distance between their awareness and the reactive ways of ego. And with time, the structure of this world will reflect this collective transformation. And that is why it is important to understand the ego. It's not just for your own benefit. Of course, you're going to be much happier and in much more bliss as you develop your ego, but really the world is going to reflect this too. And as the world changes, it's going to this love is going to be reflected back to you, and we're all going to feel so much better. So that is why it is important to understand the ego. And if this resonates with you, what I have to say in the remainder of this video will be highly relevant to your growth. But with this being said, now we can actually, on a much deeper level than we have already talk about what the ego is on a fundamental level. So, put simply, as I said earlier, the ego is the mind's operating program, and the function of this program is to construct a sense of self and personal identity that renders the individual as distinct from the world around them. And with this, the primary drive of this program is maintaining the survival and ensuring the thriving of this personal self-identity. Dr. Susanne Cooke, who is a former Harvard developmental psychologist, described ego as being the central processing unit for all incoming stimuli. In other words, the ego becomes the filter through which reality is interpreted. And so with this, every sight, every sound, feeling, thought, emotion, impulse, and sensation is relayed in our experience so as to ensure the well-being of our own sense of self. And of course, all organisms experience their own unique filter for ensuring their survival, but what makes human egos so complex is the role of language in shaping our experience, because language is just essentially these collectively shared symbolic abstractions that we project onto reality. And with this mechanism, humans can assign shared meaning to objects, events, people, and experiences, opening an enormous door for heightened communication and increased abstraction and thinking. Language also allows groups of people to unite or divide through the sharing of experiences, ideas, stories, and feelings. Language allows for people to reflect on the past and plan for the future, contemplate hypothetical situations, and imagine alternative realities. And the ego is heavily shaped by all of this, allowing one to compare and self-evaluate themselves in relation to the world around them. And as this ego is doing this, comparing and evaluating, it accumulates beliefs in order to make sense of itself in relation to others. Think things like, I'm good at basketball. In order to have what I want, I must act nice. I am the coolest person in the room, or I am ugly. And as these beliefs take hold in one's experience, you'll accumulate hundreds and hundreds of beliefs, thousands of beliefs in your life. As you accumulate these beliefs, they become sub-programs within the larger program of ego. So that is, every experience, every thought, every emotion and sensation is filtered through this accumulated web of beliefs. And unless you question the belief, unless you make the belief an object in your experience, you gain some distance from it, then you're going to be governed by that belief forever, for better or for worse. So really what I'm saying here is, in essence, what makes language such a game changer for the human experience of reality is that one comes to inhabit a complex conceptual reality that overlays one's direct experience. And a concept is a mental representation or idea that encapsulates the essential features, attributes, or qualities of a particular object, event, or experience. A concept includes things like interpretation, memory, beliefs, assumptions, ideas, imagination, fantasies, and visualizations. There's probably a few others that I'm missing, but really what you could think of a concept as is anything that the mind produces to mimic an everyday perception or experience. And the thing is, really, this is the key point here. The thing is, most people don't realize the true depth of how this conceptualizing mechanism is literally constructing their entire sense of reality, and that these concepts, in many ways, they're mistaken for reality itself. There's this guy, Peter Ralston, who is one of my favorite authors, and one of my favorite quotes of his is that, this is the quote, "We don't recognize that we live entirely within a conceptual reality any more than a fish recognizes that water has always surrounded him." So, to provide an example of how this plays out in one's experience, we can take the example of how one might assume something like sex before marriage is evil, or that their religion is the one true way, or that Jesus is the way, or it could be something like science is the only correct way to understand the universe. These are just a few very basic examples, but these notions are only concepts. They're beliefs in that they represent what is taken to be the truth, but of course these are not actually the truth or anything relating to truth at all. But concepts, which includes beliefs and assumptions and opinions, are always created by the ego in order for itself to understand the world in a way that it perceives as allowing itself to survive and thrive. So that's why people accumulate these beliefs that I just mentioned, because it actually allows them to just make sense and generate meaning in this world, which allows them to survive and thrive. And that part is key. Just really ingrain that in you in a way that allows them to survive and thrive. So yeah, what I'm saying is that, put simply, one will end up believing whatever they need to. So most people will just wind up absorbing similar ego structures as their parents, community, friends, and culture at large. This is because to go against these groups' beliefs and way of living can be threatening to the individual's survival, especially their social survival. Of course, it's not always their physical life that's threatened, but of course you want to fit in, so you end up just absorbing the beliefs of everyone else. But, let's even take this a step further. Let's take this beyond religious, political, and philosophical orientations. Let's take this to the very crux of the subject-object split that the ego creates. And the fundamental split that the ego generates is the split between self, and other. The ego, through language, it carves distinctions within reality and ascribes labels to everything. Me, brother, the chair over there, the table over there, refrigerator, the tree that I see through my window, sky, cloud, Christian, Jew, Buddhist, Democrat, Republican, lizard, dolphin, donkey, past, future, present, beautiful, ugly. This, the world of language and concepts, is what we can think of as the relative domain of existence. And it is considered the relative domain because the mind, the ego, it constructs a conceptual reality relative to the observer. And this serves the function of helping the ego make sense of the world around itself. But I want you to notice how there is no inherent realness to these concepts. Notice how they are just things your mind creates. They're just representations of reality. And ultimately anything in the relative domain is just arbitrary distinctions within reality that have no absolute ground. They're just ego-generated things that help us make sense of the world so that we can thrive and survive within it. But crazily enough, and this is really, really crazy, you're going to want to listen to this, there exists a completely different domain of existence that is completely unknown to most people, which we can call the absolute domain of existence. And this absolute domain is the aspect of existence that exists independent of the filter of ego. And because the filter of ego operates on the level of duality, dual meaning two, referring to the subject-object split that the ego creates, the absolute domain is non-dual. And in a non-dual state, there is no sense of being a person who exists here with an outer world that exists over there. Everything is one, as there is no perceived difference, no perceived inherent difference between self and other. And in this state, you cannot suffer because you're not operating from a finite, separate sense of self that could even suffer in the first place. And in this state, you can truly embody unconditional love, as you have no preferences or desires for one person or one thing or one experience over another. And in this state, you are completely free, unbounded, and authentic. You are completely yourself. The Buddhists refer to this as enlightenment or nirvana. In Zen, Buddhists call a sudden insight into the absolute as a satori. Peter Ralston, the author that I mentioned earlier, calls it an experience of real being. And there are so many other names for experiences of absolute consciousness. But sudden glimpses into the absolute domain of existence, they often usher in a radical transformation to a person. I know the first time I had a glimpse of the absolute, my mind was absolutely blown, and it completely changed the way I relate to life, see life, and my overall orientation to life and all of my plans for life. But the seeing beyond the self, the knowing that who one thought they were is not actually who they are, it can be incredibly freeing, causing an individual to completely change their way of relating to life. But this can also stir up a lot of confusion, inner turmoil, and ultimately suffering once the individual is back into their everyday ego structures. We can think of these sudden glimpses as spiritual highs, and a spiritual high is often met with a spiritual low afterwards, which is often called, in more spiritual terms, the dark night of the soul, in which the individual is essentially dying on the ego personal identity level, shedding the parts of themselves that they held so dearly to be true, but are no longer in alignment with their newfound awakening. And often when individuals experience initial spiritual highs, myself included, and are trying to figure out what happened to them and what to do about it, they can fall into this trap of trying to escape from or shed the ego completely. This is what leads people to believing things like the ego is the enemy, the ego has to die, etc., which can lead to spiritual bypassing, where people display or buff up what they deem to be very spiritual or loving or godlike qualities such as love, compassion, acceptance, having your heart very open, various displays of intelligence, and so on. And through this, one may fail to take responsibility for their actions. They may bypass emotions in order to hold up their facade of equanimity and love and bliss, or they may invalidate others' concerns as being, completely ego-driven and thus invalid because it's driven by ego, and they don't want to be an ego. They think the ego is an enemy. They think anything ego-driven is bad or invalid. And these are just a few facets of spiritual ego, and I will dedicate next week's video specifically to the intricacies and nuances of the spiritual ego. But I make this point to emphasize that ego is not something you can simply escape or run away from. The ego is wired into your DNA and neurological makeup. It's not going away, but it can be transcended, which is very distinct from removing or getting rid of or killing the ego. There's a huge difference. And as research into developmental psychology tells us, Development occurs in a transcend and include fashion, meaning that we transcend what limits us, but we always hold within us the core parts of us that shape who we are. That is, the parts that are working for us. And so I dedicate the next portion of this video here to honoring the ego, describing to you all of its beauty and all its glory, so that you will more readily include it in your growth and personal transformation rather than view it as the enemy. Because really viewing the ego as an enemy comes from a very narrow view of ego anyway. So what I'm doing here by honoring the ego is I'm describing the totality of what it is and how you actually can't even exist at all or even function at all without it. So it is really important for you to know that your ego is beautiful. The ego is an amazing entity. It's been crafted by the universe through billions of years of evolution. You are the product of life carrying out this precise egoic function of self-preservation, generation after generation. The human form that you exist in today would not even be possible to experience if it wasn't for your ancestors' egoic drives. And without your humanness, you would miss out on so much of the beauty that the human experience has to offer. Without ego, you would have no sense of individuality or identity. And as we discussed, language plays an enormous role in shaping this sense of individuality, as language serves to increase the saliency of the distinctions consciousness makes within reality. Without ego and without language, you could never ascribe meaning to things, so you would never be able to have the experience of sharing ideas, telling stories, or learning anything conceptual at all. And so you would not even be able to enjoy a novel or a film or experience art or music. Without ego, there would have never been any scientific breakthroughs, no learning of mathematics, no studying of philosophy or politics. Without ego, you would never have had the opportunity to experience the full range of human emotions, from the loss of a loved one or a heart-shattering breakup to the euphoria of genuine love, connection, and deep companionships, and just the euphoria of just reaching some goal that you've been working towards for so long. All of that's ego-generated. And without ego, you would never be able to experience the struggle of human life and thus the growth that follows. And without ego, you would never have the experience of, oh my God, does he or she like me? Oh my God, I need to get a good grade on this test coming up. Why did I say that stupid thing at this party? Oh, I wish I had as many friends as I had Instagram followers. Why am I not as confident as she is? What should my major be in college? What if I'm making the wrong decision? What if I fail? What if my dreams never come true? I hope I will be able to afford a house. Will I ever have enough money to save for retirement? What do I even want? What do I actually want to do with my life? What even is life anyway? Who am I? Why am I even here? What is my purpose for living? All of that's ego-generated, and this is what it means to be human. This is like the fundamental thing of the human experience, is going through this struggle and growing as a result of it. And there is profound beauty in all of this struggle. This is the beauty of duality. You live within it. It causes you suffering, and then you grow as a result. Without the turmoil of identity confusion, uncertainty about the future, and existential crisis, you would never experience the satisfying wholeness of finding and defining who you really are. The same is true for collective ego. Without ego, there would have never been any wars, slavery, rape, or genocide, or racism. And I know all of those things are terrible and have caused so much chaos and suffering, but also without them, there would have never been a possibility to learn lessons. If these atrocities had never happened, we would have never been able to define this is what we are not, had we not gone through these things as a species. And thus we would have never been able to define this is who we are, because we always define ourselves to the most loving thing in the end. But without ego, you would not be living in this highly complex and sophisticated society in the most peaceful, well-off era in all of human history. You probably take for granted the fact that you have a roof over your head, easy access to clean water and food, and are living in a peaceful region. And having all of these things is actually a really new feature of human existence. In the past, this really was never the case for most people. And this progress would have never been possible without the cleverness of the human ego, which seeks to self-preserve in more efficient and higher order ways. So do you see what's happening here within this human game that we are all playing? We're learning, growing, and evolving. Yes, the ego has generated massive amounts of suffering and has caused chaos, both individually and collectively, but through the suffering and the chaos, we eventually leap to a new level of consciousness. The ego becomes more open and flexible as time goes on, and as you suffer, learn, and grow, you become more appreciative of differing points of view, more accepting of diverse groups of people, more comfortable with uncertainty and change, more empathic, and you just express a greater concern for everyone and everything. You become more capable of holding paradoxes and contradictions in your consciousness because your mind is more flexible. You become more capable of dealing just with the overall complexity of life, and really overall you just become less fear-based, less rigid, less defensive, and more open and more love-based as you grow up, as the ego develops. Don't you see that this is what's happening? And maybe you're already thinking, about how this individual change manifests collectively because as this individual growth occurs on a large scale, a society with these same qualities begins to sprout into existence. And so growth in the last several decades has been responsible for things like civil rights movements, LGBTQ plus rights, and just overall acceptance, greater gender equality, greater environmental consciousness, less wars occurring. I know we have some wars going on right now, but overall we're feuding a lot less than we were in our prior history. And there's just been overall more peace and harmony on the planet. Now, I'm not saying we're perfect. I'm not saying that at all. We're very far from perfect. We have a long way to go. But like I'm saying, we're better than we were a long time ago. We're slowly becoming more conscious as a species. But none of this progress would have happened without lower, more rigid ego structures clashing and causing chaos. And this chaos caused lots of suffering and required a new, more open, expansive, and flexible awareness in order to transcend what generated the chaos. It's like Albert Einstein says, you cannot solve a problem from the same level of consciousness that created it. So we had to take a leap, and that's what we've done. And it really is not a mystery why the loving, open, peaceful hippie archetype sprouted into existence shortly after the most brutal war in human history, which is World War II. And collective ego development is precisely the reason why the 21st century has been the relatively most peaceful era in human history. Of course, this does not take away from the fact that there's still so much progress that needs to be made in the world. And I know with the wars in Russia and Ukraine and Israel and Palestine, it can seem like we're actually in a very not peaceful era right now, but I'm talking more about just the totality of the human world and how, compared to other time periods, we're just overall feuding a lot less. But do you see what's happening? This is what I'm trying to get you to see, is that we are moving towards wholeness, from separation to oneness, from duality to non-duality. So let's remember, the ego has allowed for so many beautiful things to be experienced. The experience of being an individual, the ability to reflect on our experience and seek meaning, the experience of growth and self-actualization, the ability to forgive other people, the creation and appreciation of art and music, scientific discoveries and technological innovations, and the formation of deep, meaningful relationships and communities, and so much more. These are things that the ego allows us to experience, and the best part is, as you move towards ego transcendence, you don't have to give up any of these core aspects of what ego has allowed for. Remember, development occurs in a transcend and include fashion. You transcend what limits you, but you always include the core parts of you. So you will have access to the ego's way, all of your current ways of making meaning, and your prior ways of making meaning, of seeing the world forever. You always have access to those. But in ego transcendence, your consciousness leaps into the absolute domain, and the relative domain is encapsulated within this absolute domain, meaning that you can still engage in everyday human affairs, but you do so from a radically expanded state of consciousness. The thing is, the ego can only get you so far. It can only get us so far as a species in terms of collective peace, harmony, and cooperation. There are limits to the sense of love, freedom, and authenticity that can be experienced when operating purely from the relative domain of existence. This is because ultimately to live in ego is to live within separation. This is the fundamental subject-object split that is generated via the ego's filter for reality. And ultimately this filter does not show us what is real. It's been crafted through billions of years of evolution, And the filter, it really only serves as a mechanism to serve the function of self-preservation. And what appears through this filter is ultimately just an appearance. The filter causes reality to appear in a way that is for the ego's benefit, but if one is solely identified with the appearances of the filter, reality as itself, the true reality, cannot be experienced nor perceived or understood. With ego consciousness, there's always a sense of separation or duality within your experience, and this ego consciousness ultimately closes down a true grasping of the nature of reality, a direct experience of the present moment, unconditional love and acceptance, because the ego always judges and creates conditions. Ego consciousness closes down inner peace, regardless of circumstance, because the ego is always trying to get what it wants. It's always in this striving mentality. Ego consciousness closes down true authenticity, because the ego always creates masks and personas to fit in and to survive. And also it just closes down the ability to deeply connect to others, because the ego is always caught up in its own thoughts and projections of other people, and always is just thinking about its own measures and self-inflations. But when you leap into the absolute domain, all of these points and much more become possible on a level that you've never experienced before, because you are free from identification with ego. You become directly aware of your infinite nature, your oneness with everyone and everything, and your true essence, which is being, transcends the human form. You realize who you thought you were is not who you actually are. And I know this is sounding just quite mystical schmystical, but that's precisely because it is. This is a deeply spiritual thing that we are talking about here. I mentioned this earlier in the video because it deals with becoming directly aware of the nature of reality, of truth. And this is getting in touch with who you actually are, which I'm saying time and time again transcends the human form, just what you see here, what you've believed you've been your entire life. Because who you actually are is pure, unbounded, infinite consciousness. Who you actually are is the boundless space in which all phenomena arise and pass away. You are the unconditional love that embraces all of existence. You are the source of all creativity and all potential. Ultimately, you are everyone, everything, everywhere. You are God. And if more people were operating from this state of consciousness that is aware of their nature as the whole of reality, naturally all of the parts, the individual selves, would harmonize to serve the well-being of the whole. In our case, it's the entire planet. And to better explain this analogy, just think about how there are trillions of cells in your body that are working together to create you, the whole. And when you are healthy, all of your cells, the parts, are working together in harmony to serve the whole. But when you have cancer, some of your cells have gone rogue and start serving their own selfish needs. And unless stopped by other cells devoted to maintaining the well-being of the whole, the rogue cancer cells will kill the entire organism, counterintuitively killing themselves in the process because they relied on the whole for their existence. And we can take this even a step higher in reality. Likewise, every individual human is a cell within the larger fabric of life on planet Earth. And the most cancerous humans are the ones most fixated on their own selfish interests, especially the ones that have positions of power and a lot of influence, leading them to destroy the environment and create division, separation, and disharmony between other humans and other species. Selfish and divisive ideologies such as Nazism and fascism have threatened our existence in the past, and the environmental fallout of humanity's selfish ways will be another problem that we face in the future. If human influence rendered the environment uninhabitable for life, our legacy would literally be that of a cancer. That is, a rogue species whose self-serving interests led to the destruction of the whole. You see how it's the same mechanism, just like rogue cells destroying the whole organism, a rogue species destroying the whole planet. Of course, I don't believe that's going to happen. I believe in humanity to better itself and improve life. I don't believe that will happen, but whatever the issue, chaos, division, separation, disharmony, and suffering always occur because people are not operating from a state of knowing their true nature. They are too fused to their egos, leading to various pockets of the collective ego developing a different agenda, belief system, and overall meaning-making structure, leading them to assert their own wants and needs over others, giving rise to polarization, discrimination, violence, destruction, chaos, disharmony, etc. And this is why ego development and consciousness work is so damn important, because if people were operating from a more expanded, open, and flexible way of being, the rigid, competitive, fear-based ego structures responsible for so much of the chaos in the world would give way to a more open, cooperating, more love-based consciousness that allows the whole to function just more harmoniously and more fluidly. And in hearing my words again, I know it can be so easy to view the ego as something that you must get rid of or that you must transcend as fast as possible. But I want to emphasize again that the ego is not the enemy. Remember, the ego has allowed for so much beauty to be experienced. It is a core part of our humanity, and it's not going anywhere. Don't get caught up thinking that you need to be some perfect being who is this completely ego-transcendent, enlightened master who basks in the absolute domain 24/7, who's just always this loving person 24/7 and helps others. Don't get fixated on that. And I certainly don't claim to be that either. In many ways, I'm a very, very deluded being. Very deluded. And I'll be sharing in future videos my new discoveries about how deluded I actually am and how I have been deluded in the past. This is going to be the video about spiritual ego that I talked about earlier. But anyway, becoming fixated on that ideal of enlightenment or transcendence, it stems from the ego's desire for self-inflation anyway. You know, when you're so not in that state and you want to get there, it's the ego wanting something for itself. It perceives enlightenment, which is such a loaded term, by the way. Oh my God, I'm going to become enlightened. It perceives it as being like the best thing, and then it pursues it so hard, and then enlightenment is not found in the pursuit. It's just found in accepting and being with what actually is. So it's like this whole weird thing that you just have to surrender. But what I'm inviting you towards with this video is to become more and more aware of the tendencies of your ego. Get curious about the thoughts that pop into your mind, the emotions that bubble into your awareness, and how the body reacts to all of this. Meditate, self-reflect, journal, dive into your shadow, expose yourself to more experience, push your comfort zone a little bit, learn new things, meet new people, travel, live at your edge. When you illuminate more and more of yourself, you will find your way of being to be more open and flexible, which is the hallmark of a maturing ego. And when you take this development to the end of the road, awareness eventually expands beyond the separate self mode of operation entirely, and there actually exists entirely highly complex and nuanced stage theories backed by decades of research, almost a century of research, describing all of the ins and outs, all of the twists and turns of human ego development. And to learn more about these stage theories, check out my hour-long video titled Integral Theory, the 10 Stages of Human Consciousness Evolution, for a synthesis of these different stage theories into one complete video. It would just take me far too long in this video to fully dive into that, but just to give you a general idea of how this mechanism of growth works, there's this theory that was created by Harvard developmental psychologist Robert Kegan. It's called subject-object theory. And what this theory basically says is that the subject of one stage of development becomes the object in awareness at the next stage. So to explain this further, when something is operating as the subject of your experience, it is sort of embedded and it's kind of fused to your sense of self, and it can't be seen objectively. Just to give an example, the sense of self of a fundamentalist Christian is fused to his religious beliefs. To him, the Bible is the Word of God, and therefore what the Bible says is literally how reality is for him. Reality appears that way for the fundamentalist Christian, and if he were to mature and develop, he would be able to gain a little bit of distance from these beliefs, allowing him to, self-reflect and introspect and kind of see these beliefs objectively to see if, they're really true or not, if they're really even serving him or not. But if they're fused to a sense of self, he's never going to actually see it objectively. He's never going to make that subject-object transition, and so he's never going to be able to reflect in it because it's fused to a sense of self. And so to give you another example, think of how when a baby is born, he's just kind of fused to his reactionary immediate impulses and needs. And when a baby is born, there really is no subject-object split yet. The baby is purely one with its reactionary impulses. But then, as the baby develops into a toddler and a young child, it differentiates itself. She realizes that she's an individual, she has her own self-interest, and to satisfy this self-interest, there's kind of rules that she has to follow, consequences if she doesn't follow them. And so in this development, what once was the subject at a baby level of consciousness, which is the immediate reactionary impulses, becomes an object at a young child level of consciousness, allowing the toddler to kind of gain some distance between these reactionary impulses and kind of regulate itself to a degree that it can kind of satisfy its own self-interest and follow the rules, which is now the subject of its new experience, which is like the rules and kind of the emotional environment. And this subject to object flip keeps happening throughout the course of development, which lasts one entire lifetime if you want it to. But if you keep digging deeper, and that is until the entirety of the ego becomes an object, so to say. There's so much that what makes up an ego. There's like emotional patterns, there's beliefs, there's labels, there's all these patterns. And if you're illuminating more and more, you're making it kind of not a subject, you're illuminating it into an object, which allows you to kind of see it from a distance and not ultimately not see it as like inherently you. Then you'll no longer be fused to this operating program that is your mind. And the new subject of your experience becomes free, unbounded, infinite consciousness. And right, this doesn't mean that the ego goes away. It's a part of you, but you don't see it as your ultimate identity anymore because it's now an object in your experience. You know it's not really inherently you. It's just another aspect of experience, no different than the trees blowing in the wind or just like the cat running across the street. It's just another object in your experience, and it's no more real or no more you than any other object in experience. But as we're developing, as we're making this subject to object move, our personal filter and our experience of reality, it changes a little bit. Like I said, this way of becoming less narrow-minded, less individualistic, and more open, flexible, and with a broader, more holistic concern, because you become this way because you stop identifying so much with your own selfish interests and you begin to identify with everyone and everything. You become more loving, and the primary reason or driver behind this change, as I think I've mentioned time and time again, is awareness. As we gain this awareness, we take a step back in consciousness and become more able to see our identity, belief system, values, thought patterns, habits, and emotions as an object in awareness, allowing ourselves to reflect on and introspect on these aspects. And from there, we gain greater and greater insight into our true nature, which is infinity. It's everything and it's nothing. It's the totality of existence. It's pure consciousness. It's love. It's God. And from this heightened awareness, we become more able to transcend what is limiting us. Because, right, it's not just a subject anymore. We're making an object and we gain some distance from it. That's like the first step to overcoming a limitation. It's not the only step, though. Other work has to be done. It's not like you just illuminate this thing in your awareness and you're free from it. It's not how it works. I think you can intuitively tell how that doesn't work. But as you do this work, ultimately, you usher in a new, more mature and conscious and loving way of being. Yeah, guys, so everything that I laid out here today is like basically all of the knowledge that I have about ego based on my several years of learnings of psychology, various philosophies, various spiritual philosophies and stage theories of human psychological development, as well as my several years of direct experience and practices such as meditation, contemplation. I got a journal every single day. I've done a lot of psychedelics in my time that have all served to illuminate the inner workings of my own ego. And as I speak here, I realize there's actually a lot more to talk about, specifically when it comes to the ego's defense mechanisms and everything that the ego employs to avoid truth, to avoid reality, to avoid its death, its annihilation. And when I say death, I don't mean like physical death, but the death of what the ego identifies with. So I think a part 2 on this topic is warranted to dive deep into all those mechanisms that the ego employs to avoid reality. And if you would want to hear about that video, please leave a comment. I'll only make it if I know this topic is something that people want. But anyway, what you have watched here are the fundamentals of the inner workings of this operating system or filter that has defined your sense of self and shaped your experience of reality for the entirety of your life. And getting to know this operating system, just a reminder, it's so important because it's responsible for all of the meaning you create in your life, everything you believe, and basically all of your thoughts, emotions, behaviors, and motivations. So in all of us, there are aspects of this operating system that are highly functional and serve us well, but there are other aspects of this operating system that are withholding us from a deeper, more peaceful, intimate, blissful, and enjoyable existence. And really this video is just meant to get you started, because the real work comes from your own consistent and dedicated practice of illuminating the inner workings of your ego. So now it's time to go do the work on your own. Now it's time to do things like intake new perspectives that go against what you hold dearly to be true. Read books, watch podcasts, videos, and films. Write about these perspectives to harmonize them in your mind. Follow your curiosities. Follow what makes you feel excited. Follow your heart. Get the fuck out of your comfort zone. Live at your edge. Ask yourself powerful questions and deeply contemplate them. Spend intentional time in nature. Do your stream of consciousness journaling. Do some art. Self-inquire. Meditate. Hire a life coach. Maybe that could be me. Go to therapy. Really embrace your suffering and feel it fully through. Travel to a foreign country. Embrace different cultures. Just expose yourself to a lot of different experiences. Hang out with cool people that make you think different. But just remember that the key driver behind all growth and maturation, again, is awareness. So the intent behind all of these practices that I just said is to more deeply illuminate the fullness of who you are. And awareness isn't the only thing that is needed. It's also about embodiment as well, which, yes, is essential, but it's really about getting the realization into your body and being that love that you are at your core. But don't take any of this too seriously. Enjoy your life. Do what makes you and others happy. Growth and development for the most part should not be a chore. For the longest time, I was unconsciously operating from the belief that I had to transcend the ego as fast as possible, because that's how I thought I could help the most people and live the happiest life for myself. But it may have been a noble desire, but it was also in the mentality of trying to get away from or get rid of the ego. It was ego trying to escape ego. I was a snake biting its own tail. And this caused me to become overly fixated on my own growth, kind of obsessed with it. I would become hard on myself for not progressing as fast as I thought I should, which took me far away from the present moment, grasping and desiring to be elsewhere. And it seems counterintuitive that to progress, you have to be content with the appearance of not progressing. But I suppose that's what progress is now, at this point. To truly progress would be to let go of the idea of progress at all, as all these stage theories can appeal to the ego, causing it to fiercely desire reaching the end. But anyway, I hope this video was helpful to you. If it was, please like, drop a comment, and share, because it helps the algorithm promote it so more people can see it. And if this was a beneficial video to you and you want to take this growth a step further, then a wise investment into your growth could be hiring me as your coach. I have a 10-week program called Spiritual Fitness that is designed to accelerate this process. I have other offers as well, but I try to make my prices very inclusive and affordable, that, for someone who's truly desiring to grow themselves, can have the opportunity to do so in a very structured manner through the coaching process. And if you are interested, please book the free 60-minute discovery call. There will be a link in the comment section. It's a free call where we just get clear on your topic for coaching and your goals in life. And through that, we'll see if we're a good fit to work together. And we'll see how I can help you. And yeah, that's about it, guys. I hope you have a great day, and peace.